Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you guys are having a good weekend. Uh, we are getting close to the end of the semester. We basically have about a month left. We've got four more chapters to cover, and then we'll be done. So that's pretty exciting. I want to remind you to make sure that you keep up with all the work and don't get too far behind so you don't leave yourself vulnerable or stressed out by the time we get to the end of the semester, okay? So please don't put yourself in that position. Um, Overall, I'm pretty pleased with what I'm seeing. Really enjoying seeing all your comments and your reflections and discussions. So I'm very pleased to see what you guys are producing. So good job so far. Um, just keep up the good work and don't run out of steam, okay? Because we got a short month and we have holidays coming up, so that's a good thing. So enjoy those as we get ready for them. Um, So this week we're in chapter five, and chapter five really is a chapter that focuses. It's an extension of what we looked at in chapter four, which when we talked about security issues and just some of the issues around the context of security and in a broader scale. Today we're going to look at in chapter five more sort of detailed and specific views of some of the issues that are directly pertinent to where we live today. We'll start off looking into and diving into more deeply into some of the pressing fundamental political challenges that face the world, uh, really confronting the issue of war and peace. It's interesting. If I can find the video, I'm going to load it in there called Why We Fight. And it's an interesting sort of parable about the sort of psychosis of why in America we're always locked in some sort of military conflict. And frequently we always say we're off to fight for the good common cause. But in some ways that's true, and other times it's not. War is big business, and the military industrial complex is a multi billion dollar industry. And so, with that, uh, you have to keep justifying the cost for ramping up and more weapons and things like this. The problem is our adversaries do the same thing because they had to prepare for the potential of us being, deciding to come after them. So it ends up being really a zero-sum game and where we are continually escalating each other. And because of that, we find ourselves in a very precarious position. Um, so in this chapter, we're going to find some specifics. So we're going to start off talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and some of the nuanced details of there. And from there, we'll move into talking about some of the issues regarding weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear proliferation, chemical biological warfare, and why some of those things are things we have to really consider in this 21st century, and what happens if some of adversaries decide to get their hands or utilize them, and the things that can happen as a result of that. And then lastly, we'll talk about terrorism. Uh, and so this is my direct field of expertise. I'm a Middle East expert and also an expert in nuclear proliferation and weapons of mass destruction warfare. And that's what all my graduate work was focused on. And so it's an area that I find very interesting and challenging because the policies that we develop around these areas are very specific and are constantly changing because the world is constantly changing. And one thing that's interesting about this is that never at a time in our history have we possessed the capacity to kill with greater devastation than any time that we have right now. And so, because of that, just because you have big weapons, I would argue it's very dangerous and calculated to if you ever decide to use them, because once you pull that trigger, you can never go back. And if you go back and look at the first atomic bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima, Japan in 1945, and then Nagasaki right after, um, it's interesting to note that those weapons were, in terms of the number of people they killed, were incredibly devastating. And the weapons we have today are hundreds of times more deadly than that was. So imagine that, if you would, that the thermonuclear weapons that we possess today can do hundreds of times more damage than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, at the end of World War II. Uh, and not to mention the growth and development of biological weapons. Uh, Even with regard, it's interesting because we don't know the facts, but even when you talk about things like some of the diseases that have come up more recently, um, how you use biological weapons and what happens if you can't control them, and the potential risk for killing human life, and then if they mutate, like viruses, for example, what happens then? So there's a lot of interesting issues around this, and we're going to jump into a little bit of it today. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, so in this chapter, one of the things that we have to first ask ourselves is, and I mentioned earlier, is the question of, why do we fight? Um, And I'd like you to think about that for a moment in terms of why the U.S. goes to war or intervenes in other people's wars. Why do we do that? Uh, do we do it because we're going to protect these people from potential incursions by their respective leaders? Are there direct threats to the United States? Um, what drives us? And you know, I think sometimes the public has a persona that is justified because that's what we are told publicly, but privately, there are things that I think that you would find quite disturbing. Uh, there's a video we're going to be watching in this chapter that I'm going to load up. Actually, I realized that I just saw that it wasn't in there, but I'm going to load it up about the Iraq War. And And when you see some of these things, I think you'll find some very disturbing questions that you'll have to think about for yourself and answer, because sometimes, what we get rallied, we wrap ourselves around the American flag and we go to fight and we go to confront these bad guys. Um, and yet, we rarely do we ask the people in those countries if if the if having us there did any good. Um, and frequently the answers are answers we don't like. Uh, but I think you'll find as you watch the videos in this chapter that you'll find them compelling and somewhat disturbing, and why we have to do a better job of making sure that we are the people are in charge of the outcomes and the decisions that are made regarding the implementation or utilization of our troops, and also the weapons that we utilize, and what are we really protecting? Is it just protect our money and our way of life? And in doing so, do we have the right to intervene in other countries and cause the deaths of their people? Uh, I will share with you real quickly here as we start. Even during the Cold War period, if you look at Central Latin America, the United States is responsible for the deaths of over 500,000 citizens of Central Latin America over the last 50, 60 years. And a lot of it had to do with that we used the justification of the threat of communism into the Western Hemisphere. But then you find out it really was protect our financial investments in these countries. And so we forced out their democratically elected leaders who were trying to nationalize their crops or their commodities in their country to feed their people, and in doing so, violating U.S. economic our philosophy, and anything that's a threat to our national economy or to the corporations who are responsible for that is considered a national security threat. So that is incredibly problematic and dangerous as we proceed here. So let's jump into this. So reasons for conflict, as I said, there are lots of them. Some of them are justified, some of them are not justified. It just sort of depends on where you are and why you are where you are. Um, but in that, some of those reasons could include, political dynamics. Uh, they could be economic dynamics. It could be institutional changes, behavior regarding the institutional framework of the countries, whether, like, for example, shifting from democratic states to totalitarian systems or authoritarian systems, or vice versa. The civil wars or civil crises that arise that sometimes develop into regional conflicts. They can be based on religion, ethnic divisions, all kinds of things can lead to conflicts. And so, with that, it may be, and arguably as part of our human nature, maybe we're always wired to have conflict. Uh, but because of that, we have to also be able to understand and recognize that the weapons that we are able to use to mitigate those conflicts. And as I said earlier, never at any point in time in history have we possessed the capability to inflict such massive destruction on any individual or group or country than we do today. Um, so with that, it's become, because the weapons have become more powerful, uh, we have to assess, those countries, and particularly rogue countries, their ability to access nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, for example. And then how do we go about managing those threats? How do we manage the threats that come back to haunt us for some of the policy decisions that we have inflicted on other countries? Uh, and so, leaders, when we talk about responses, leaders usually use symbolic uh, things to be able to, or symbolisms, if you would, to be able to sort of get people, sort of focused on a purpose, or to drive a particular ideology, or even justification for going to war. So, like I mentioned earlier, the American flag, and we see all commercials about, armed forces that look really cool, to get people to want to join up. I'm a former military man. I was Air Force intel officer. So there's all kinds of things that get why people want to, become part of the military. I wanted to fly jets, but I ended up going into intel because I had a bad knee. Uh, so, but the idea behind this was just recognizing why people get behind the causes or support the causes that America gets behind. And that's because it'd be very difficult for the United States to go to war without having the country behind it. And they learned a lesson from Vietnam about this, because in Vietnam, which was the first televised war where they got to see little Johnny blown up and people coming back in body bags, and very political wars, this really changed the people pushed back on that, and that became very, very a point for the government, that they realized that in order to go to war without having too much friction, that they had to create a mythos about why they were going to war in order to justify the actions they were committing. And so this is where we find ourselves, and this is where the manipulation of power is utilized so we stand behind the ideologies of nationalism, and to defend and protect our way of life, because they'll make us believe there's some perceived threat to our national interest, uh, and they'll justify saying that there was some, aggressive behavior or belligerent behavior by the other countries or other non-state actors, and they just have used this as a point of justification for the things that go on. And then the other types of conflicts, they're also what we call territorial conflicts, when you have disputes over land and over resources, natural resources, whether they be, of course, food, water, uh, those types of things, and even access to uh, geopolitical or geostrategic areas, an area that might be valuable or may have resources that are valuable to a particular country that is wealthier, like the United States or China or Russia, one of the countries that really the main drivers of the global system. Um, Another part of this, when we talk about or territorial conflicts, of course, around the issue of land, has to do with, of course, because of these historical, fights, you end up with these people who hate one another a lot of times for reasons that don't even make any sense anymore. They've been fighting the same battle for sometimes decades, centuries, or a millennia. Um, and so it's interesting how, like I mentioned once before, how when you're looking at a picture of planet Earth from, from say a picture from one of the spaceships, and you see the planet, you don't all you see is landmass and water. You don't see the borders that are created by man on a map, on a physical map. And so a lot of these boundaries, these artificial boundaries and, that are territorial have caused a lot of the conflicts that we live with today. Um, and then, of course, out of that, arises civil wars and political wars, and all types of governments rise and fall as a result of this. And some examples of this would be like in Rwanda, Somalia, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Syria. Um, usually it's the civilians uh, who tend to suffer the greatest. Sometimes you hear them called collateral damage, but these are the people who typically are the ones who get sacrificed at the altar of these psychological and physical use of force conflicts. Uh, and then it's important to note that it's very difficult to contain multiple forces that jeopardize what we call political security. And so, understanding that, let me skip up here. I wanted to share with you first that we're going to be talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I have a map here of the area of Israel, which is in the sort of dark purple, and then the peripheral areas. You can see down here that Egypt is to the south and southwest, and then Saudi Arabia is over here. Jordan is on the east, on this part of directly east, and then just above there is Syria and Lebanon. And so these are, when we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I wanted to give you some context so you can see what it looks like on a map of the area we're going to be discussing here briefly. And this is, of course, over here to the left is the Mediterranean Sea. And so this is to provide you some context. I was in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, and both actually, and I spent about 5, 6, well, actually longer than that, about 5, 6 years ago. I was there for about 3 weeks, and it was really an amazing experience. Just an amazing uh, country with lots of conflict, but also in some ways, like when you're in Tel Aviv, which is right here in the central, a lot on the coast. It's like being in San Diego. It's a beach town, and with some nuances, of course, but it feels very, very much like you're in a bubble. You wouldn't even know you were in a place that had much conflict because of where it resides. Um, but anyhow, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the case of the Israel and Palestine. And in some ways, you could argue that this instability in the Middle East has been ongoing for thousands of years. There's been border and territorial and and religious disputes, ethnic disputes since going back to the time of the Persians. Uh, and so it's not surprising that you see the conflicts that we see today. Uh, and with that, a lot of it the disputes had to do with anything, as I mentioned, from religion and land resources and access to minerals and, food sources and things like this. Uh, but there's also the long-term implications have been significant, and the global implications today have been tremendous. As many countries have tried to create a level of stability in the Middle East that has not been there, ever. And so, certainly there are countries that are, vying for power and privilege in one side or the other of the conflicts that exist. And sometimes it depends on who's in the room and who's driving the ship in terms of negotiating. Frequently, those who have been, historically, if you look at the history of this conflict in the last, let's say, 50 years, uh, those who've been trying to push for peace on both sides and even those on the periphery of helping drive peace have been killed, usually by their own people for trying to push for a peace that sometimes the people don't want themselves. Um, and so with that, let me just digress for a moment and tell you how this conflict starts. And it starts with the Balfour Declaration. And basically the Balfour Declaration, which was written in 1917, was written to basically lay out the plan for creating a Jewish state or Jewish national home in in the land of Palestine. Now, a lot of people don't realize that Palestine, the Jews, there were indigenous Jews that lived there, that had been living there for thousands of years, and so the idea of creating a home for them was first created, or the notion was created by a gentleman named Arthur Balfour, and he's the one who had pronounced this idea of a national home for Jewish people. And so he's the one who starts the idea. And then by the 1930s, that when Hitler comes to the rise, and the Jews are starting to be persecuted in Europe, where they had been living for hundreds of years, the idea was for them to escape, to avoid the Holocaust, and to come back to their area called Palestine. Uh, and of course, it sounds like a great idea. Go back to wherever your roots are. But this is one of the things that I think people don't realize. It's very difficult to go home uh, if you've been gone for hundreds of years. So a lot of the Jews that are coming back to this area, this land of Palestine, are Eurocentric. They've been living in Europe, and even though they may be Jewish by heritage and maybe by religion, the fact is that they've been intermingled and intermixed with Europeans for hundreds of years, and so their upbringing, their way of life is very different from the indigenous Jews, the Palestinian Jews, if you would, who had continued living in that area, for thousands of years. And so when you drop a group of people back in, it'd be no different than if you took, black folks who had been in America for 300, 400, 500 years, and then said, okay, go back to Africa, or we try and move back to Africa. And well, we may be African American and black and tied to Africa by our historic roots, but being in America for generations and just popping back into the mother country, it's just not that they wouldn't welcome you, but it's going to be very, very different because we have been socialized in this country for, several hundred years. No different than Hispanic folks who've been in the United States for several generations who would go back to Central Latin or Mexico. It's very, very different. And so it's not as simple to just say you can just pick up and go home and everybody's going to welcome you, because it didn't happen that way. And so the Jews who went back to Palestine, under the Balfour Plan, there was a decision that was made by the new United Nations to divide Palestine into an independent Jewish and Arab states. And this resulted in the 1948 war. Israel and the state of Israel was established, and there were many people who didn't like it. This led to a civil war. The Jews won what was called the War of Independence. And it was like, yay for the Jews, but the Arabs saw it, and there's a term they use called al-Nakba, which means the catastrophe. And they looked at it as incredibly problematic. They felt like the legacy of colonialism in the region was still allowing for those who had subjugated them to be able to now have a foothold in their region. And so the war resulted, and when the war fighting stopped, of course, the state of Israel was formed, even though it was geographically smaller than what they had planned. The city of Jerusalem was divided, and then some of the peripheral countries gained additional territory. And this is sort of the ironic part. Those who were upset about it were really upset about it because they were they were looking out for themselves as opposed to looking out for the real concern about the Jews, much more about how could they access and create more territory for themselves. And so there were many refugees that were left out. It was this was the beginning of a conflict that has lasted from 1948 certainly until now. So you're talking over 70 years, probably getting close to 75 years. Along the way, there have been multiple wars, like the Six-Day War in 1967, and uh, this war was very pivotal because it established Israel's sovereignty over all of Jerusalem and the West Bank territories. Uh, they also gained a lot of control over Gaza, which had belonged to Egypt, as well as some other strategic areas as well. However, taking possession of these areas added even more animosities and political, uh, you know, tensions as a result of Israel taking on and taking over most of these occupied lands. Uh, Palestinians did not acknowledge the legitimacy of the state of Israel. Israel did not accept the right of Palestinians to have their own state as well. So we had this sort of very precarious coexistence of these two sides uh, that was marked by, very episodic outbursts over periods of time. So a lot of times we would see, like for example, oops, I jumped too far ahead. Sorry. Uh, we had what was the Six-Day War. I should say after the Six-Day War, we had the 1973 war, sometimes called the Yom Kippur Wars, uh, which again had this particular war had a significant impact on the oil producing countries and oil supplies around the world. So the price of oil skyrocketed and the global economy was severely affected as a result of it. Also during this time, as you can see, the organization called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the movement was born in the 1960s. It led to this fight against Israel, and their goal was really to establish a Palestinian state and retake some of the territory that they had lost in the 1967 and 73 wars. There were a couple of major players in here. One was Fatah, which was the largest Palestinian group that was actively engaged in the armed struggle against Israel. It was led by a very charismatic man named Yasser Arafat, who died in it's about 2005 or six. He was at one point, because they were working with him so diligently to try and broker a peace. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year many, many, many years ago on the front cover. So, but he was very enigmatic, very complicated in many ways, but also was considered one of the prime people who was if peace was going to be had and stability in that region, he was the one who was going to get it done. Uh, but also because they couldn't really they couldn't get to an agreeable framework to move forward peacefully. The Palestinians and Israelis sort of had continued conflicts from this point, even going forward into from 1973, again, as I said, even up until now. And so with that, uh, for example, the United States put in efforts to solve by using Egypt as a sort of a proxy to try and help work with Israel to sort of mitigate this conflict and trying to get recognition for Israel as a state of its own. And there was a very famous Egyptian president named Anwar Sadat who had worked very diligently with the United States to try and broker a peace between Israel and the Palestinians, uh, and also to stabilize the relationship between Israel and Egypt as well. And so in 1979, they met at Camp David and they wrote the peace agreement. They're called the Camp David Accords, uh, which was basically the first step in a two-pronged step to first create stability between Egypt and Israel, and then the next step was going to be to set up the connection between uh, the Palestinians working with the Egyptians to try to help broker that peace. Um, so during the Camp David Accords, Egypt became the first Arab state to formally recognize Israel's right to exist. And while Israel agreed to return substantial portions of the Egyptian land that it had won in the 1967 war, uh, and then the United States also pledged considerable economic and military aid to Egypt for allowing this to happen. So this was really the beginning of a very long relationship to help, again, sustain the peace between Egypt and Israel. Unfortunately, Sadat was assassinated by a ultra right wing individual who did not want to see. Felt like there was a lot. Well, let me just say there was a lot of stress going on inside of Egypt. Many people were upset that he was working with the United States, and there had been an attempted military coup several months before he was assassinated in 1981, and then finally he was assassinated later in the year, and things started to again fall apart after this took place. And so also at this point in time, the first Intifada took place. And again, an Intifada was basically like an uprising. And this is the Palestinians, of course, rising up against Israel. The Israelis were very, very heavy-handed against the Palestinians, and so it's interesting how the West sort of portrayed the Palestinians. They would show pictures of Palestinians throwing rocks and assaulting the Israelis, and then you would see pictures of the Israelis being more victimized, and then others inside had a different view of the picture. And I'm not saying one is particularly right or wrong. There's enough right or wrong on both sides that, and many of the people who suffer become the next radicals or people who are utilized for suicide bombings and things like this. Uh, Also, later on, in by the early 1990s, they met again in Oslo, and this was the first step in the Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. And it set the stage for a comprehensive and permanent peace. Uh, and so this was a huge step forward. However, I will say that unfortunately, the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated by one of his own people, again, because they did not like the fact that he was capitulating, or not really capitulating, but I would say he was brokering a peace that many folks said wasn't, there were those who strongly disagreed with it. And then following the signing of the formal treaty between Jordan and Israel in 1994, which followed up as a result of the Oslo Accords. And then, unfortunately, because again, just because you have moments of peace, this is always very cyclical. And so there was another intifada that started right around 2000 and lasted until about 2005, which is again another uprising. And in the era from around 2000 until and throughout the, let me just say it this way, and throughout this period of time, there are many in both sides who were really trying to get things done to try and work their way through this uprising. And Bill Clinton tried to salvage a deal. Yasser Arafat and the Egyptian president at that time, the Israeli prime minister at that time, Barak, uh, basically couldn't get it done. And so when the talks didn't work, then the second intifada erupted, and then that lasted, as I said, for about 5 years. Uh, they tried to work out a two-state solution so the Israelis and Palestinians could, mitigate the conflict. A lot of this had to do with uh, giving back territory that the Israelis had taken in 1967 war, and uh, and so that was a big uh, step in the right direction. However, there were many who were struggling with the idea of how that was going to happen. So this is where we find ourselves in terms of this conflict. It's ongoing, it is not stopped, and we will, and you will see rather shortly here what these types of conflicts lead to.